Thank you all for coming out tonight. I hope you all enjoyed the film. I want to introduce to you tonight's moderator, Mara Webster. Mara Webster is a programmer, event producer, content curator, and interviewer. She's the co-founder and head of programming for In Creative Company, a year-round digital talk series focusing on in-depth craft-driven discussions around the creative process across film, television, theater, and the arts. She has also moderated numerous panels for other companies, including Netflix, Apple TV+, HBO, IFC Films, BAFTA, and several film festival Q&As. I'll let Ms. Webster introduce the talent. Have a great night, y'all, and see you at the reception.
Delicately throwing my bag in the corner. Thank you so much for coming out to tonight's screening. I hope that you really loved the film. It's such a beautiful piece of work. Please join me in welcoming our panelists tonight, starting with director Marc Forster, author Raquel, Palacio, and executive producer Renee Wong. Raquel, I wanted to start with talking about the way that you created this book, because you'd also written the book Wonder that movie was based on, and it carries forth the character of Julian that we knew from that story into this one, and kind of enters into another chapter. And at the same time, this was also your first graphic novel that you created, and so I was so interested in just the genesis of the idea of carrying a story from one of your pieces of work to another, and the idea that you felt like a graphic story was the perfect way to tell this.
Well, I'd never written a graphic novel or drawn one, and one of the reasons, I was a design and art major at Parsons School of Design, and after writing Wonder and becoming sort of a full-time author, I kind of missed that part of me, the graphic artist, the designer. So I thought it would be fun to just do a graphic novel, not realizing it would be just how hard it would be, because for a lot of different reasons, but I just kind of threw myself into it. The reason I wanted to tell Julian's story, though, specifically, is because I never, and this was a purposeful thing, I never gave him a chance to really speak for himself, or even a chance to redeem himself in Wonder. He was a bad boy in Wonder. He was the bully, and as the author, I knew what was motivating him. But I also didn't think that it was respectful to Augie to really tell the Julian story in Wonder. So I wanted to give Julian, as a character, a chance to grow and learn from his mistakes and redeem himself. And setting him in this larger context of the storytelling, of having his grandmother tell him this kind of epic story, was an opportunity to kind of flex my graphic novel skills, tell a novel that's set in history, which is something I really wanted to do, tell a story that was rooted in a lot of the issues that I felt as a country and in the world that we are facing today. The rise of anti-Semitism, the rise of fascism, the othering of people, the hate speech, a whole bunch of things that happened to Sarah that I saw beginning to happen around the world. I just thought it was really important to tell this story now, not realizing how timely it would be 5 years later. And anyway, this is a long-winded way of answering your question, but I just thought it was a chance to get Julian to redeem himself.
No, those are all such wonderful details. And Mark, I've heard you say that, the book really gave you an immediate sense of visually how you saw this story coming to life on screen. And I was just very interested in your experience of looking at the pages of the book and how that really lent itself to the way that you started mapping this out.
I read the graphic novel sort of 6 weeks into the pandemic when we all went into lockdown, and the script as well, and instantly I got very emotionally involved and teared up, and that never happened to me, only when I read Finding Neverland, basically, back when I did that movie. But so I felt like, because I was emotionally, it moved me so much, I said I have to tell this story. And ultimately, it's it's a way of, I think, a Holocaust movie. There have been many movies about the Holocaust, but I have never seen a story being told through a teenage love story. And I thought that way of storytelling would open up the Holocaust to a whole different audience who might not be interested of really seeing movies about the Holocaust. And I thought it was very important to tell this story, and hopefully a lot of young people will go and see the movie as well. And after Raquel wrote Wonder, and Wonder became such a phenomenon that that audience who embraced Wonder would be older now and might also be interested in seeing Whitebird.
Yeah, it's wonderful. And Renee, I mean, I wanted to ask you about the development process for this, because there's obviously always such a huge amount of time between the idea of creating a film and actually rolling cameras on the first day. And for this project in particular, what were a lot of the elements in terms of how to tell this story that you were all trying to figure out during that time?
Well, as you know, we shot this during the pandemic, and it created a really unique set of circumstances to make a movie, and some of them were actually advantageous. So, we, as Mark said, it was 6 or 8 weeks into the pandemic, and we got this script. It was so moving and so beautiful, and we thought, we have to do this. So we actually just launched right into an agreement, to do it. Our production designer, Jennifer Williams, who was in England at the time, decided that she would go ahead and just go out there on her own in the middle of this pandemic and start to assemble these locations and send us photos back as we started getting clearance to travel. So we all arrived there, and I think in the sense of it being an advantageous situation, everyone brought the utmost that they had to the table to make things move very quickly. So we had about 3 months of pre-production, which is normal for this size of a budget and a film, but it was utilized in a very streamlined way.
And Raquel, with what you were talking about with developing the book and the story, was it the themes that kind of drove the initial conception of it, or was it the idea of Sarah and this very individual story as a lens into that idea?
It was both. I think as a storyteller, it's nice to be able to use a character as a wedge into a wider story. And for me, Sarah very much represented a girl, a young woman on the cusp of growing into a woman that a lot of girls could relate to, I thought, whether they were into historical fiction or not. This was a girl who was, in the beginning of the story, rather frivolous and focused on, the world moved around her, but she wasn't really focused on that. She was focused on the cute boy in class and things and her friends and her popularity. And I thought using Sarah as sort of the wedge into this historical story, and then having Julian, modern day Julian, anchor the modern day story was a good way of balancing the two stories, because they are, in a way, this is a story of Julian's growth and this is a story of Sarah's growth. And in fact, what Mark does so beautifully in the movie is he manages to intersect those epiphanies in a way that that really, I think, bring my graphic novel to another level. I mean, bring the story to a cinematic level that I couldn't have imagined in the book.
Right, and you almost have these two coexisting visual languages in the film, because you have the color palette, the look and the feel of Julian's story, and also Sarah's story. And so how did you figure out what you wanted each, and also where you needed those connective threads to be, particularly with what Raquel was just describing, of them both having that same epiphany at different points in different ways?
Yeah, I pretty much lined that out already in pre-production, and sort of because I feel like, at least for me, I make most movies in pre-production in my mind, and how I lay them out and structure them, and then ultimately, once I'm on set, sort of execute what I prepared. So a lot of it, I sort of we laid out, and there were a couple of times which in the script, Mark Bomback in the adaptation didn't cut back to Grand-Mère, and I felt like, and I talked to my editor, I said, look, we should cover this and we should cover that, and I went to the AD and said, let's shoot that as well with the grandmother, because I feel like, those are moments which I think could be very important of her telling the story. And you also have someone like Helen Mirren, which is such a profoundly incredible actress, that she's really sort of the backbone of the story, of the narrator, that you want to cut back to her and you want to see her, and because she's so profoundly emotionally can convey something even without words, that you want to see her when she tells a story to the modern day Julian Bryce. In regards to the color palette, the costume designer Jenny Bevan, who is a very talented two-time Oscar winner, and Jennifer Williams, the production designer, Renee and I, and the whole sort of team there with all the head of departments. We discuss all the different colors and color palettes with the DP as well, and how the lighting schematics, where the light will be, especially in this film, where the light will be and where the darkness is, because obviously you have.
Matthias Königsweiser is extraordinarily talented.
Yeah.
Indeed.
And we you juxtapose the dark with the light, and so that's a part of the construct of the movie.
Yeah. I mean, I wanted to ask you both a little bit about the lighting, because it has to very much look and feel like natural light throughout the entire film, and you have a lot of scenes that are very self-contained within the barn, and a lot of scenes at nighttime. And so, what were some of the gifts that gave you of having this self-contained location for a lot of the story, but also some of the challenges like figuring out the lighting elements?
You want to go first?
Well, Matthias had really thought out very clearly that location of the barn, with Mark. And as I think you're referencing, there's lots of little shafts of light in their minds. It was really interesting to watch this process because Sarah was living in that barn in secret. So, Matthias would have these long conversations with Mark about there being a very, very limited light source. Otherwise, she'd be found out. But then, as the movie progresses, as she grows, as the love story grows between her and Julian, more and more, these shafts of light start to permeate into the scene. And then, obviously, the magic realism, and you should speak about that because it's such a window into their souls and, into the story at large. But there was a great amount of thought about how to use minimal light to tell this story, and given that one agreement that if she were seen, she would, die. So.
Yeah, as Renee said, as their love story evolves and sort of their hearts connects and their heart opens to each other, the more light comes into the barn. And also in Julian's and Orlando's, who plays during in the story, he, when I talked to him about the acting part of it, we start with him that he's at the beginning, he's not seen by the others, and his acting is much more hunched down, and he's sort of like not seen by any of Sarah or her friends. And as the story continues and they connect a heart, he ultimately starts to move more up and becomes more charismatic and becomes sort of like a movie star. That you also the way we lit him, and that you almost forget that he's actually walking on crutches, and that's so you completely his evolvement or his evolution as a character is very much like that as well.
Yeah, and I love the magical realism that even early on in the story when Sarah's describing the woods with her parents, and it felt like a fairy tale. So it's not what do the woods look like filled with bluebells. It's what does a child's vision of that look like? And it feels like that's very consistent throughout the story. And so how did you always set about making sure that it was always through the lens of Sarah and how she's viewing the world?
Yeah, that's very, very much so that you are in Sarah's point of view. And I must, in Raquel's graphic novel, which she illustrated as well, and it's like really, the bluebells are illustrated so beautifully. And when I was thinking, okay, we have to, once you see the illustration, I said, okay, we have to really deliver with those gorgeous bluebells. And we had some real bluebells, and then sort of in the distance, the VFX, we just doubled them up.
I just wanted to add, because one thing is to have something in your head that you're illustrating, and and you can get away with certain things in a graphic novel, or even just writing a novel. You could just simply say something like the bluebells look magical or something. To actually translate that cinematically as masterfully as these guys have done is truly, I think, a testament to the work that all of you did, because again, mentioning Matthias, the cinematography and the lighting and everything, there's a texture to this film that makes the magic realism work. Like and whenever, I was a little afraid in the beginning when I first read the script that we might go too far into it had to be done with a certain amount of subtlety and grace, and that's one of the things that I love the most about their adaptation, the way they brought it to screen.
Yeah.
Coming from you, that means a lot.
Thank you, Raquel.
I also think one of the things that's really interesting about both the book and the film is the way that it respects its audience, and it's told as a story that adults can step into this world, but it's also accessible for kids, and kind of balances that line of being very truthful and honest about these experiences and things that people went through, but also not kind of showing too much of some of the reality. And so with the book and the film, I just wanted to ask a little bit about balancing that line and just, the respect that you have for the younger audiences and doing that as well.
I will say that I take as a parent who my kids are grown now, but and as an author, I've always felt a certain obligation to respect the innocence of my readers. I don't want them ever to read something that I wrote and not feel good about it later, or to get to have nightmares or anything. I know that there's certain writers that will do that, and that's a whole other thing. But it's just not what I've ever wanted to bring to the world, and especially to my readers. So when dealing with dark subject matters like the Holocaust, and you can't get much darker than that, I was very aware of the fact that there were going to be many readers who have never even, at the age of 10 or 11, have never actually even heard of the Holocaust. I mean, the statistics are kind of mind-blowing in terms of, the fact that the Holocaust isn't even taught as in the curriculum in the United States until like the 8th or 9th grade, when most kids will read the Diary of Anne Frank. But a lot of kids really grow up not knowing anything about it. So I was very conscious of the fact that this is a very, very difficult theme that is going to be the first time that some kids are reading about. So in the book, I was, and it's hard to use the word gentle it was a gentle introduction to the Holocaust, as if such a thing could actually be, but I did want to be very careful of not going too graphic or not getting too, into the concentration camps and into the darker aspects of it. Though in the book, we provide a glossary so that if kids want to learn more, they are more than welcome, and there are links and there are all these other age-appropriate information for them to have. I thought, and I'll let Mark and Renee speak to that, but I thought what is that they took that very same sense of respect for readers, viewers, and there's a restraint to what you've done, which is something that as a parent, I think a lot of parents would really, really respect.
I tried, it's also culturally how I got brought up. There's a certain, I'm Swiss, Swiss German, but there's this cultural restraint and repressed emotions. so ultimately, that translates into your work as well. But we're not really, like I learned the first time in America, everybody says, "Oh, I love you." It's like, what's very foreign. But you don't express it that freely. But at the same time, I think in storytelling, in storytelling, it's very, I feel often if you don't say something, and especially to your audience, you want to be respectful to your audience, and you want to let them, often, ultimately as a storyteller, you manipulate. We all manipulate as an author or storyteller, because you decide what's being seen and what is being heard and whatnot. But you'd still try in a story like this, which is so emotional. When I first read it on the page, I got moved to tears that I felt, okay, I have to really restrain myself in across the board, because it can very easily can become too cheesy or too much. And it's so you constantly try to restrain yourself in the storytelling, and also make sure that you respect your audience.
I think too, you know, the visceral nature of the violence that you're kind of referring to that could have been there, it's a natural, like Raquel set the tone of this, and then, you know, when you're adapting something, you kind of naturally adapt to that tone. So that was part of it, but there's something to be said too for not showing something and having it being more powerful. And that, I think, is part of the way in for all audiences, but, you know, this kind of unique age group where the innocence is something that we should all protect in ourselves. You know, that's something that it's not just for younger people, it's for all of us, and it's how we create our future, how we solve problems. You know, if we have that innocence of heart, we'll be able to do anything in the future. And there is part of that ingrained in this story, you know, asking us to preserve that, maintain it, grow it, and experience it with each other. And that's the way we will go on in the world and solve our problems.
I think that's such a great point. Raquel, I also wanted to ask you about the grandmother character that obviously is played by Helen Mirren wonderfully in the film, because I think there's something so real about seeing a character who has never sat down and told this story to her grandson, and you know, he's aware that she has stories from this time that she finds it very difficult to talk about. And I think whatever trauma people experience, that's a very real thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was just interested in the scope of developing that character and that idea within her.
The grandmother was very, very loosely inspired by this. So I spent a year, I studied abroad in Paris. I spent my junior semester abroad many, many, many years ago. And I used to take the 82 bus down from where I lived to my school, the American College in Paris. And every day, a couple of stops ahead of me, there was a woman on whom she was like this very elderly grande dame, beautifully, beautifully dressed. And she would get up, and she had a little cane, and she would hold court. And basically she would just start conversations and with people. She never talked to me because I think in my army jacket and jeans, I didn't register. You know, I just wasn't what she was looking for. But I was always eavesdropping on her because I thought she was fascinating. And I remember one time she said something, and it's in French, and I'm not about to speak French now, but it was basically, I remember it was very specifically, well, I had a very frivolous childhood, but then when the Nazis came, that all changed. And I remember hearing that and just wondering, what is her story, you know? And obviously, I you know, these are little things that you kind of tuck away, and then come to fruition, you know, 30 or 40 years later, when you're suddenly writing a book. But she was my inspiration for the Grand-Mère, just visually, and then kind of once you, I mean, writing is a lot. In some ways, it's kind of like acting. You kind of take on a persona and you kind of inhabit that character a little bit, and suddenly you know their backgrounds and stuff. And I kind of knew who she was the moment I started writing her. It's weird how writing does that. I don't know how to explain it really, because there's a little bit of alchemy in it, and I don't know, but she just kind of came.
I didn't know that story.
Yeah,
About that story.
yeah, no, that's
Such a cool story.
Yeah, and she and Helen Mirren is like brought to life. That character brought to life. It's crazy.
It's interesting because I always felt like when I read the graphic novel book, I felt like that it's such a brilliant story device using the grandmother, because I felt that immediately I was connected, because I had a grandmother and she had so many stories to tell, and I never as a kid completely listened to her. Just only with one ear. I came in, came out there, and I felt so many elderly people have so much history and so many lessons they could teach us and could mentor younger people, and we never take advantage of that.
Mm-hmm.
That's such a great point. And then lastly, Mark, I also wanted to ask you a little bit about the post-production of this film, because it kind of goes back to even just the idea of what you were talking about earlier, and finding that rhythm between the present and the past in the story, because I imagine there was a lot of delicate finessing to figure out the pacing and the rhythm that this story required.
Yeah, as I'm shooting, Matt, Jesse, my editor, is cutting. So every weekend we basically reviewing cuts, and Matt shows me what he's cutting, and I always feel like, oh, did we miss something? It's a constant dialogue back and forth between us, between Matt and me every weekend. And so we pretty much like when he says, oh, we maybe could do something here or here, that I pick it up on, on the day, that we don't have to come back and reshoot it. But so in post, once we were actually cutting the movie, we pretty much had everything. The key things was the transitions of going in and out of magic realism, and we worked with Pierre Buffin, has a visual effects house in Paris called Buff, and he's a very, very fascinating guy when it comes to VFX, almost like an artist, painter himself, and sort of, it's ultimately, you ground the story in reality. You have Sarah and Julian come together, and then we have Julian, the skeptic, who doesn't want to go onto these journeys, and she's in the barn, and I could personally relate to this when I read the book as well, because when I grew up in Switzerland, my parents hadn't a TV at home, so I always had to entertain myself versus being entertained, and I always went into the forest and had my imaginary friends. So I felt I could really relate to that character, living in your imagination, because it gives you also hope and joy and all these emotions. So ultimately that you start slowly in the transition, and ultimately you can start onto the journey, and that kind of visual transition between magic realism and reality is a tricky one to find.
Yeah, the details of how it all came together are so wonderful to hear from all three of you, because it's such a beautifully crafted film, obviously based on an incredible book. So thank you so much for sharing the film with us and all of your experience, and thank you for coming to tonight's screening.
Thank you all. Thank you.